DeShaun Tate back live with you one more time. The final buzzer with DeShaun Tate, episode 9. We usually do this typically every 15 minutes after the NBA playoffs conclude for that individual night. So we recap the games of the night. And let me say this first. Make sure that you go and follow on social media at Tate's Take Hoops, TATESTAKEHOOPS, where basketball lives. And be sure to subscribe anywhere that you find your favorite podcast, that being iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Red Circle, and on YouTube. Don't forget about that YouTube channel as well. Now, a little bit of background noise there. Apologize about that. Let's get all that off of there. All right, perfect. So let's jump into the first game of the evening, where we had a game 6 between a number 2 and a number 3 seed. 2 and 3 seed for both of these games. The Toronto Raptors take down the Boston Celtics 125-122 in a crazy thriller, and it just kind of feels like every week there's been a new thriller or a new game, a new series, pushing these game 7s and so forth. And so I'm really excited to know exactly where you guys personally really excited to know where you guys personally stand in regards to whether or not you feel that it's best to be in a situation, I guess, like the Miami Heat, who's sitting back and waiting and collecting a bunch of rest, or if it's best to just kind of, I don't know about staying fresh, but just staying sharp and continue, not saying lose on purpose and extend the series by any means or stretch of the imagination, but to be able to stay sharp by staying in games and then going right into the next series without a ton of rest, like you see with the Miami Heat. So you know that you can join the show at your convenience down there on the ticker at the bottom on here, streaming live on StreamYard. Series tied now, 3-3, going into game 7 of these Eastern Conference semifinals. And I got a boatload of stuff that I want to get to in regards to the Boston Celtics. But first, let's go through a couple statistics for the Toronto Raptors. Norman Powell, who again has kind of been that unsung hero coming off the bench in a lot of cases for the Toronto Raptors. 23 points, 2 rebounds, 1 assist, 2 steals, 1 block, 6 for 11 from the field, and 50% from 3. That's pretty damn good. Got into a little bit of a shouting match with Marcus Smart, which I thought was pretty intriguing within its own right. Pascal Siakam, who has not really been all that great in this particular series. They've been winning games when he hasn't been great. They've been losing games when he hasn't been that great, obviously. And I really believe that if they find a way for him to get going, specifically in a game 7 situation, this is a game where they can really have Boston on their heels if he just has a good game, like a slightly better than average game. He doesn't need to be necessarily the Pascal Siakam that we have kind of gotten accustomed to over the course of the last 2 years or so. Fred VanVleet, a little bit more of a mixture of good and bad game, I guess you could say. 21 points. 9 rebounds, 7 assists, 2 steals, 2 blocks, only 2 turnovers. That's about as good as it can probably get. I'm sure you can get a little bit better than that, but the 30% from the field and 25% from 3 isn't going to cut it. However, his backcourt teammate and Kyle Lowry, who was magnificent on tonight and been trending in the right direction anyways, a little bit different than OBJ for the Browns football, but trending in the right direction and on social media and just really getting a lot of publicity, and deservedly so for what he was able to do tonight. 33 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, 2 steals, 1 block, 1 turnover. You can see why this game was won when you look at the backcourt for the Toronto Raptors, the starting backcourt anyways, where you only have a total of 3 turnovers between their primary ball handlers being VanVleet and Kyle Lowry. 3 total turnovers combined. That's about as good as it's going to get from a combination of a backcourt altogether, something they needed if they didn't want to go home. Back to Canada, 12 for 20 from the field and 60% from 3. Serge Ibaka, okay, 13 points, but another unsung hero, specifically and especially for this particular series, where he pretty much saved the series with 0.5 seconds left. And what was that, game 3? OG Anunoby with not just 13 points, which isn't necessarily eye-popping, but one thing that it was is just the fact that the 13 rebounds that he pitched in made a huge significant difference. Now for the Boston Celtics. Okay, I don't know if this is just me or if you guys kind of feel the same way. Feel free to let me know. And per usual, you know that you can always feel free to kind of chime in with your questions, your comments, and your opinions, as well as you can see down there at the bottom on the ticker. When we start talking about guys like Kemba Walker, and I know that he gets a lot of credit, deservedly so, for when he does well, but I don't think when he has games like this that he gets criticized nearly enough, because he's a huge part of why this team did not win tonight. 5 points, 4 rebounds, 7 assists. The 4 rebounds and 7 assists, cool. 7 assists, you're supposed to do that as a point guard. Probably could have done a little bit more, but I'm okay with that. But the 5 points, 2 for 11 from the field and 1 for 6 from 3, not just this game is where I have a problem with that, but even more so the fact that that's what he's been shooting somewhere around that range from 3-point percentage, from distance anyways, as of late. And I think that that's something that if that happens again or anything remotely close to that, like he has to be more than half of that better for them to win this series on what night will that be? On Friday night. Marcus Smart, I don't think anybody would disagree, as he's an all NBA defender, making the defense, making the all defensive team for the NBA a top 5 to top 10 perimeter defensive player. And I'm honestly a little bit curious as to know whether he or Jimmy Butler has been more clutch in the playoffs. I think it's a lot closer than people think. Granted, this is going to game 7, and Miami has not lost more than a single game in this entire playoffs, largely in part because of Jimmy Butler. However, I think that Marcus Smart has done a significant job of that as well. Also, not having Gordon Hayward, that's 17 points in a game that you pretty much are erasing from that standpoint. And to not be an automatic go-to scorer for your team, expected to be more of a defensive stopper than you are offensively, I think that, he's obviously done better than, mediocre from that standpoint. And kind of curious to know, do you believe that guys like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum is the NBA's best wing duo in the NBA or even in the Eastern Conference? And so the problem that I had with going back to Kemba Walker now is that in this particular game, he scored his first points with 8 minutes and 25 seconds remaining in the third quarter. And that's just something that you can't have. Luckily, you do have Marcus Smart to pick up a large bulk of that load, especially in the backcourt. But you're somewhat of a liability on defense because of your size. And that's where he has to be better, because these kind of performances and the contribution and the production that Marcus Smart is bringing is really nothing more than a bonus. And if I would have told you that he would look better on the offensive end than Kemba Walker does going into this series, you probably would have called me crazy for that within its own self. So I really feel like if Toronto wins this series, Boston beat themselves, and not in a complimentary kind of way. They have nobody to blame. They have no fingers to point to but themselves. You have a head coach in Brad Stevens being someone who I really feel like, what's it mean for him as an underachieving chip that he has on his shoulder. And so from that standpoint, I really do believe that this is one that he needs. And I'm not sure if it'll put him on the hot seat, but expectations are high when you're talking about Boston basketball in the NBA. Not saying he should be fired, not saying he's going to get fired, but I do think that there needs to become a point where it should raise a few more eyebrows than it actually does or actually has. And I'm afraid that some of the youthful playoff inexperience is kind of showing a little bit for this team. And so Uh, Boston was in that conversation not long ago, literally just days ago, less than a week ago, of being the most impressive team in this playoffs, along with the Miami Heat. And now Miami is in the driver's seat as the clear-cut favorite for the most impressive team that we've seen in the playoffs. Now, that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to win. Can we see Toronto in this thing? Absolutely. Going to the finals. Can we see Boston going to the finals? Absolutely. Can we see Miami going to the finals? As crazy as that was to think that and to say that before, right when the playoff seedings really came about, it's really not nearly all that much of a stretch as, right now as it was at that point. So I think that is going to make for a really intriguing basketball within the Eastern Conference, but I'm not sure anybody's really giving the Eastern Conference much of a shot outside or just giving them a shot to match up and meet up with somebody from the Western Conference. And so Boston, I really believe, with having Jaylen Brown, he stepped up and took the initiative after he blew, I guess, a defensive play, or the defense. He collapsed himself in running out to guard OG Anunoby with that 0.5 seconds left in game 3. But he's done a very, very good job, obviously, of making up for that. 31 points tonight, 16 rebounds. You heard that correct. So sometimes I don't understand when Kemba Walker and Jason Tatum's getting all the credit all the time. Jaylen Brown is one that is a true baller, if we're just being honest about it, but doesn't get nearly the credit that he deserves when you start talking about this Boston team. And he is relatively consistent every night. When you had situations where, they were having issues in the locker room or whatever the case may have been with Kyrie Irving, Jaylen Brown was still playing ball. When guys like Gordon Hayward went down with that ankle injury, that really ugly injury, and even with this injury, Jaylen Brown stood up, and stood in place. There were times when, not that long ago, while you have someone like a Jason Tatum who has played much, much better ever since last year, really the duration of all this year, and has looked a lot better. Some people forgot about some of his disappearances, and Jaylen Brown didn't come in with so much of the hype that Jason Tatum did. Jason Tatum is a top 3 pick for that particular draft a few years ago. And so I really believe that Jaylen Brown is one that deserves a lot, not just a little, but a lot more credit than what he's getting. Daniel Tice tonight for Boston was just backdoor Joe all night long. I mean, he was just really catching those backdoor lobs. And he had a pretty good game for himself as well. I think 18 points. He got up in double digits, somewhere right around a double-double, which is outstanding for him because he's another one who's a workhorse, and Boston doesn't have a lot of front court players that they can rely on. He has been one for them. Between he and Jaylen Brown, I really believe that they are more so the ones carrying this team than Kemba Walker and Jason Tatum is. So when you start looking at the statistics, I told you this thing was about as even as it can get. Call me Steven, because this thing is even. And I remember saying that to a few different people. I think we had Jeff Goodman from the Stadium on our podcast a couple weeks ago, and just kind of picking his brain and talking to him about this series as it was forming and matching up. And I really thought that it was very even. And clearly we're talking about a game 7 here in this situation. Boston out-rebounded Toronto by 12, 58-46, and had more assists by 10, 32-22. But where it really helped Toronto at is that they had more steals. They kind of locked down and clamped down and got into that defensive stance and had more of that dog mentality in clutch and crunch moments when it mattered and counted the most. 10 steals versus 5, so they doubled that number, and they doubled the number in blocks, 8-4. So they did their part defensively, but you can't always guarantee that, because very much like what we saw in game 6. So in game 5, they look like a totally different team at that point. So I think that'll be interesting to see how things kind of unravel or kind of pan out on Friday when that game takes place. Now for the second game of the doubleheader, where we saw the Los Angeles Clippers, the 2 seed, take down another number 3 seed. That happened again tonight, 96-85. The Clippers now leading that series 3-1 in the Western Conference semifinals. Let's start off with the winners. Let's start off with the Clippers. I want to start with Montrezl Harrell. Let's take a drink on that one because I want this one to kind of settle in. I don't think people are getting nearly certain guys are not getting nearly the attention. I get it. He's a six-man player of the year award winner for this year. But I'm not sure that Montrezl Harrell still gets the love that he deserves because you have so many other guys out there. Not saying Kawhi Leonard doesn't play defense. We know that he does, and he's all defensive team as well. But doesn't get the credit that he deserves because he doesn't score the amount of points that Sweet Lou does or Paul George does. He's one of those guys. I feel like, how can you not love this dude? That's where I'm at with Montrezl Harrell. He is my type of player. He is every coach's type of player that they would love to have. He is one that forces you to respect his game. He has a hard work ethic. He has the physicality. He's a rim runner. He's fearless. He brings energy. All of these things are what makes up championship teams. Much like in Golden State, we saw much of that with Draymond Green. A little bit less athleticism for Draymond, more IQ, that type of deal, but it still had the same feel. It was still very similar to the same role that Draymond had. And just still talking about the Clippers, Paul George, to see how the Clippers handled their business on tonight with Paul George being in a peculiar situation and picking up his third foul with 7 minutes or somewhere in that range remaining in just the second quarter before the half. Hadn't even played half of the second quarter yet before he picked up his third foul and went to the bench. And that's when this team just kind of locked in. And you speak about locking in. You're talking about this team's defense. I mean, think about the way that they can contest and alter shots because of the fact that their perimeter defense is so good. That's one reason why we haven't seen Jamal Murray, which I don't want to hear any excuses from people when talking about Jamal Murray. And, they went game 7 with Utah and it's tough to turn around. We already know those things. But he's a ball player. Same way he was getting the credit and they're showing him on, every other, commercial, just kind of talking about his performance from Utah. I don't think that that's deserving going into this particular series. Maybe up until game 2 against the Clippers. After that, start washing it away because he hasn't looked remotely close to being the same. And I understand that the Black Lives Matter movement is the more important thing behind why they keep showing him in that interview. However, you do have to take into account the reason why he's even here and having these interviews is he's here to play basketball, and he hasn't done exactly that. And that's not totally all his fault. He's up against a really tough challenge, going up against some of the best perimeter or the best perimeter defensive guys in the league all on one team right now. When you start talking about the Claw, Kawhi Leonard, arguably or inarguably the best two-way player, and I hate that term and that phrase, but two-way player in the NBA. You also have Pat Beverly, who is the most tenacious, stifling defender, pest, as I like to call it, that there is in the NBA on any point guard as well. He kind of reminds me of Floyd Mayweather sometimes, where you got all that yapping and all that jaw jacking before the game even starts, and you know that he's there to intimidate and get into your head. By the time the bell rings or that, the ball is tipped up into the air, trying to use a little bit of a boxing reference, there's been so much trash talk throughout the duration of that time that it's like the game or the match is essentially already over with at that point, especially if you're a player like Murray where you don't have nearly as much experience and you don't have a ton of veteran leadership on your ball club either. So Montrezl Harrell, even, who's not necessarily a perimeter defender, but a defender up front. And that's what's going to make that team so hard to beat, whether it's, the Nuggets, whether it is the Lakers, whether it is the Rockets, whether it's the Raptors, whether it's the Celtics, whether it's the Heat. Throughout all of those teams, there's still going to be really tough matchups because of not just their defensive intensity, what they can bring on the offensive end, and the energy that they bring, including starters and off the bench as well. This is actually the fourth time that the Clippers has held a 3-1 lead in franchise playoff history. So congratulations to them on advancing and just being one win shy away now from getting to the Western Conference Finals. Now, as far as the Denver Nuggets go, I want to start off here first. I want to start off with a player who was lighting it up specifically in the first half. He's got some things he needs to improve on, and we'll get on that here in a second. But I like people to be able to see that there's a balance between this player from Denver. You have to be able to take the good with the bad. And that's going to happen with every individual young player that comes into the NBA. And that's Michael Porter Jr., who had a really, really good first half. I'm starting to see the steady improvement from Michael Porter Jr. He's got the smooth shooting stroke. He does lack the strength quite a bit, but I think that takes time. Any kid that's 21 or younger, it takes time for you to kind of build up into that, NBA build or that NBA body, so to say, especially for a guy who's 6'10". I think a lot of times he gets stuck staying on the ropes, and I call that on the ropes, I guess, being a boxing reference again, but more so for him kind of he's out in the corner and kind of stagnant sometimes and kind of, I guess, cornering himself in that position where there's not a lot of room to work and put on display and showcase his attributes and his skills and the things that he can really do for a guy his size. And so he is slowly embracing the physicality. I do see that. And he is becoming more assertive, but it's going to take some time. And if he's the guy that you're looking to carry you the way past the LA Clippers, a veteran leadership team and guys who have world championships or just coming off a world championship, specifically in Kawhi Leonard, then there's a huge reason for why this series is 3-1. And to be honest with you, may not have surprised a ton of people if this series was over 4-0 in a sweep, bring out the broomsticks already, just because of the simple fact that Denver was coming off of, a 7-game series and so forth. So those are just my overall thoughts specifically on Michael Porter Jr. Denver, I feel like, had their chances to take advantage and to sustain some offense or some confidence, rather, coming off of Game 3. Or they had that in Game 3, and they didn't do that. And they started to look mentally defeated in probably the last 12, 16 minutes, maybe 18 minutes, maybe of Game 3. And I think that that's something that you've kind of clearly seen now in this Denver team. They seem very out of sync tonight. They seem they appeared like mentally defeated, very frustrated, kind of. And you can't argue that again with the defensive players, specifically on the perimeter from the Clippers. But they never led in this game, and they put out there a display of their worst shooting performance of the series. And clearly they've kind of exerted a little bit of too much energy to be going up against a team that's well rested and vets like the LA Clippers are. And so Denver also, are in position where no team has erased a 3-1 deficit in the same playoff series or in the same playoff season. So it seems very unlikely. Can it happen? Sure, it can happen. Will it happen? Probably not. The only reason that it could happen is because they still have another game to play in which they, I guess, could win. But I'm almost scared to know who you are if you like to pay attention to those betting odds out there in Las Vegas. I can't imagine that too many people are going to be taking that as an opportunity to put a little bit of change in their pockets. And so, getting back to my very last thing when it comes to Denver and Michael Porter Jr., I think that when you're talking about how his game needs to grow, and this is actually a bright spot for the Denver Nuggets because this is essentially their franchise. I mean, not everybody's going to see it that way or going to call it that. But if you're a smart man, you're looking at how bright the future is for him. He needs to be better defensively. He needs to understand and learn the personnel. And I heard a little bit of some of the broadcasters and some of the broadcasts from tonight, in which, well, I think it was Stan Van Gundy, and kind of taking a page out of his book, but I want to make sure that I give him credit for that. But yet still, it made for some very good points. And his court awareness needs to be a little bit better. Again, he's young, so that's going to happen. You know, his body type needs some improvement. But I think that will happen over time, and that's what the next level is for Michael Porter Jr. But also noting that one thing that has just been killing me, and this is kind of in conclusion for Tate's take for the night, is that there's just far too many of these replays, I believe, that is slowing the game down. I don't think that we trust the officials nearly enough. This is a game that I can't really get upset when people feel like it's watered down and that it's softening up. I think the officiating is softening up and trying to get every little thing, every little play and every little thing right, every call right, and this and that. And I understand that's their job, and they get paid a lot of money to do that. But, you know, where were we years ago before we had instant replay to go off of? You know, we had to deal with the decisions that the officials made. Now, I'm not saying don't go out there and get it right. However, what I am saying is that I just think that it's watering the game down. It's slowing it down. It's taking 10 minutes or so to review a call, in which some of these games are either A, just getting started, making it really hard for the guys to warm up, B, right in the middle of a game where it's, you know, really at its highest peak and level in terms of competitiveness, or it's at the tail end where guys understand are dead tired and they're beat and they're ready to hit the showers and they can't wait for the game to be over. And I understand when it's a close game, but in other situations and circumstances and instances where games are pretty much out of hand and you're still going back to do that, we have far too many calls being officiated. I'm going back and looking at replays for calls that don't need it than we do calls that actually do need it. And so I think that that's something that we're having a hard time. And that's just a little bit of my gripe. That's just a little bit of the way that I feel about some of the things I've seen on tonight, and something that's just been happening quite a bit, you know, if I'm being honest, in the NBA. And I really appreciate Jeff Van Gundy. Appreciate you. Al High, who is a frequent listener and watcher of the podcast, as well as what you're watching right now, that being the final buzzer. So yes, Jeff Van Gundy, not Stan Van Gundy. I was trying to figure out between the two. The brothers. I know that they're both brothers. Sometimes I have a hard time deciphering between the two, but you too can be much like Al High, where you can go and subscribe, be a part of the show anytime. Feel free to drop a comment. Feel free to follow us on social media. But first, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, Tate's Take, TATE''S TAKE. We do that regularly. We bring on all sorts of really neat and awesome, interesting and intriguing guests. We've had everyone from the likes of Jeff Goodman, Jay Billis, Scoop Jackson, Arthur Trish. We've also had on Michael DeCourcy. We've had on Sekou Smith. And we've got some really awesome guys coming up really soon, too, to talk about the NBA. But Rick Kamla is another one. We've had some really interesting guys that have came on and talked quite a bit about sharing some different stories and things like that. You can all go back and find that where we have in some of our archives, where you be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Tate's Take the Podcast. Anywhere that you find your favorite podcast, that being Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Red Circle, all of the above is where you can go and subscribe to not have to worry about me putting up all these social media posts and let you know that we're going live. You can always go and subscribe and get the notification to your phone. It's just that simple. So be sure to do that. And last but certainly not least, be sure to follow along on all social media platforms at Tate's Take Hoops, TATES TAKEHOOPS hashtag where basketball lives. So that's it for episode 9 of the Final Buzzer with DeShaun Tate. Again, every single night. So we'll be doing it again tomorrow night, Monday through Friday only. Only Monday through Friday, every night, recapping the games from that night about 15 minutes or so after the NBA playoff games conclude. So until tomorrow around 23 hours or so around that time, I appreciate everybody for checking this out. For those of you who will check it out later, maybe get some of the recap on tomorrow morning to kind of get prepared for tomorrow's game. And I would say games, but only one game being played since Miami has already advanced. That is a 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I believe. Showdown game 4, but in the Western Conference semifinals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Houston Rockets. So appreciate everybody for checking me out.